Welcome back, everybody. We are doing good on time here. And again, a big thank you to Dr. Gonzalez for taking the time out of your busy schedule to participate in this much needed workshop. Moving on, let's just do a time check here. We have our next presenters that are going to go to 12:15. Josh, what are you thinking? We could adjust this to give our speakers till 12 o'clock and add another 15 minutes?
Sure, that's fine.
And it gives us just over an hour and a half. Okay, so let's go on with the show here. I'm really excited about our next presenters. I had the privilege this summer to attend a National Association of Drug Court Professionals, which we work closely with AOC here with the state of New Mexico, which we have some representatives from the state administration of the courts. I think I got that wrong. Right, I apologize if I got it wrong. But through the National Association of Drug Court Professionals, it's one of the best, if not the best, training conferences where they talk about, the judicial system working with providers, and we really need to. And how are we promoting a recovery-friendly community, even inside, the judicial system, law enforcement, and so forth, to address the issue of substance use disorder in our communities? Incarcerating our way into this has shown that not being effective. The war on drugs, showed to be ineffective, and mainly, the social and institutional inequities, especially amongst people of color, that, the war on drugs seem like to target, and that's a fact. The thing is that when we were looking at cannabis use disorder from a treatment provider here in New Mexico, we were looking for presenters to give a nationwide perspective of the issue of cannabis use. And I was fortunate to come across these two professionals out of New Jersey that gave a presentation at this National Association of Drug Court Professionals Conference, RISE 22 in Nashville, Tennessee. And I was like, wow, we need to bring them to New Mexico. And when I asked the first call, they didn't blink an eye and they said yes. So we're very grateful to have these folks. I'm going to read a little bit about their presentation, and then I'll do their bios for the introduction. And I'm going to try to slow it down because to not be talking fast so you all are comprehending and getting the information. One of the presentation that really intrigued me that I seen live was based on this. Medical and recreational marijuana have thrown behavioral health treatment providers into a frenzy. What do we do with individuals who have a problematic cannabis history, but now possess a cannabis card or claim solely recreational use? Ironically, the impact of cannabis on recovery and health can remain regardless of the origin or legality of the source. The societal changes are not as complicated as they appear. In this presentation, it will help you simplify and unravel the cannabis enigma. One, learn when and whether cannabis use disorder can be diagnosed in the presence of medical and recreational marijuana use. Look at the overall overview of the medical and psychological conditions for which differentiate among states, allowing the use of medical cannabis and current recreational practices. And also they'll be able to speak on the science of impact of cannabis on the body, brain, and recovery and legal. So our speakers, we have first out of New Jersey, Emil Affsa III serves as the judiciary of the state of New Mexico, the state of New Jersey's statewide treatment assessment services for the courts coordinator. He is responsible for the clinical supervision, credentialing, and clinical oversight of the substance abuse evaluators working in the courts throughout New Jersey. Emil has extensive experience working both mental health and substance use disorder treatment, including multiple levels of care and treatment modalities. He has presented multiple times to the National Association of Drug Court Professionals annual conference on multiple topics. Emil holds a master's in counseling from Seton Hall University and is a licensed professional counselor, licensed clinical alcohol and drug counselor, and a certified clinical supervisor. Our other speaker is Jayne Cavanaugh. She has served with the statewide treatment assessment services for the court since 2007 for the state of New Jersey, providing clinical supervision for some 70 use disorder clinicians across all divisions of the courts. Jayne has been employed as a clinician in the addiction field since 1983. Jayne holds a master's in Christian counseling and often offers experience in treatment and assessment, as well as has experience in substance abuse prevention, community education, and alcohol and drug training. Help me welcome both our speakers from the wonderful state of New Jersey. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Thanks. So Jayne, do you want to start off and describe a little bit more about what we do in New Jersey? And
Sure. And you'll be pulling up the PowerPoint for us. So.
Yeah, let me see if I could share my screen properly here.
Okay. So what we do, as Lawrence did such a nice job. And first of all, I really want to thank you for inviting us to come. The only thing that would be better is if we could be in your beautiful state. I did have the privilege of going to New Mexico in 2015. My husband and I landed in Albuquerque and had lunch at the Route 66 diner and then drove up to Santa Fe, and it was just beautiful. And I really love the people as well. So it was so nice to be able to be invited here. But what Emil and I do is we're basically the clinical supervisors for all the counselors that work for the courts. In New Jersey, the court system employs their own substance abuse counselors so that we can do diversion, whether it be drug court or it be juveniles who are in trouble, or family court where there's a divorce situation and people are fighting, or someone on probation that needs help. The goal is to divert them from the legal system back and get them treatment so that they don't reoffend. And that's what our job's about. We have 70 counselors that we provide clinical supervision for. And it's a great program. We see lots of success, and it's very exciting to be speaking with all treatment providers today. Did you want to add anything, Emil, or should we just jump right in?
I think you covered the main points of it. I am very pleased to be able to do this presentation. It was very nice meeting Lawrence over the summer. I will add one little tidbit. My dogs are going to do a public service for everybody. So if there happens to be a squirrel outside the window, Amazon delivery truck, or a random dog walking by, my dogs will make sure you know that. So I will try to mute as quick as possible if my dogs do start to bark. Jayne, I think you're in the office today, right?
Yeah, I'm in the office over there.
Should be no dogs barking for her then. There's no dogs in the office. But yes, I guess we could just jump right in. I would like to say, if you have questions, I'm trying to work off of two screens here. So if you see me looking over here, I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat. But Jayne, I think between the two of us, we'll try to keep an eye on the chat. We want this to be interactive. So if you have any questions on any of the things we're bringing up during some of our slides, please feel free to engage, raise your hand, turn your camera on, chat, whatever it may be, because we want this to be as useful for you as possible. If you have specific questions you were hoping to have answered when you saw this topic we were presenting on, please make sure you get your questions answered. And I think we'll move right along, and hopefully, can everyone see? I think everyone can see my screen.
Yep, you're
sure?
good.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so Lawrence reviewed the objectives for us and what the topic is about. And we found this really necessary because we saw this happen in New Jersey. As soon as medicinal marijuana came on the picture and then recreational, people just went into a frenzy. They didn't know what to do with it. And the courts didn't know what to do with it, and treatment providers didn't. So that's why we wanted to put this topic together. In the three objectives that Lawrence mentioned, we're going to go through each of those objectives in sequence as our presentation. And we will definitely make this available to you if you're interested in making it your own and sharing it with other folks. So And on our next slide, we wanted to find out where you folks were at with as far as medicinal and recreational. So we did our own little research and discovered what much of what Ms. Edwards shared in the beginning, that it became medicinal in 2007, and you guys were the 12th state to legalize it for medicinal purposes. 2021, I really like what you folks did with it, with making the Cannabis Regulation Act, where you put together the recreational and the legal, you merged them, which New Jersey hasn't done. You know, they're kind of both separate, and they're out there as separate. But of course, as you know, what this did, the Cannabis Regulation Act legalized cultivation, manufacture, purchase, possession, consumption for adult use, anyone over 21. Cannabis Regulation Act combined both the adult use and the medical. We had the privilege of meeting Dominic last week, and we know that he's at the helm with the Department of Health with the medicinal marijuana. And within the commercial framework, you've got the Cannabis Control Division. So those two agencies working together. Cannabis businesses still have to be licensed in New Mexico. It remains illegal to cultivate and do it for commercial purchases, to sell it for commercial reasons, to be your own retail outlet. So you can grow it for yourself. Adults 21 and up are allowed to purchase up to 2 ounces or 16 grams of extract, 800 milligrams of edibles. For licensed retailers, allows adult to grow up to 6 immature plants for their own use, and a total of 12 plants within the household. It's illegal to consume marijuana in public unless it's in a designated consumption area. And I thought this part was interesting too, because this all began with the retailing in April 1st of 2021. And it didn't take long, maybe 19 days, till our next slide, where there was actually the New Mexico 420 Cannabis Fest. And I don't know if anyone went to that. You can feel free to throw a thumbs up in the chat if you did go and you have something you'd like to share about it. But of course, don't forget the t-shirt if you did go. I thought it was interesting, though, that it was kind of a Woodstock throwback with the caption of on their website of 1 day of peace, love, music, and art. You know, that was actually part of the advertisement. So did anyone go, by the way? I don't see any thumbs ups in the chat, but maybe you don't want to say. That's okay.
This may not be the audience that would have. It may not be.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about objective 1. As Jane mentioned, there's like 3 things we're going to go over. So first is learn when and whether cannabis use disorder can be diagnosed in the presence of medicinal and recreational marijuana use. So pretty straightforward. Okay, so what does it take to diagnose someone with a cannabis use disorder? For those of you working in treatment, you should probably have some general idea of that. For those that aren't, you're going to get a little additional information. Can a client with a medicinal cannabis card be given a diagnosis of cannabis use disorder? Can a medicinal user get addicted? If a doctor is prescribing medicinal marijuana, how can a substance abuse clinician say that the client has a cannabis use disorder without playing doctor? You know, there was that debate early on, especially in New Jersey when that happened. What can we say? A doctor said it's okay. Cannabis is legal. How can we say that recreational use is a substance use problem? All right, so a word about scope of practice. So that's one of the things we think about is who is qualified to say someone has a cannabis use disorder. So at our last bullet point there, I'll skip ahead. In New Mexico, you have an LADAC. So yours is a licensed alcohol and drug abuse counselor. In New Jersey, we have an LCADC or CADC. So it's different sort of lettering, but essentially the same thing. So it's whoever has the proper credentials for your state law to make those diagnoses. Someone who doesn't would be violating New Jersey, who have the Consumer Affairs that does the licensing. So you could get a fine if you're deciding to say, I'm going to diagnose someone with a substance use disorder when I don't have the appropriate credentials to do so. So we want to keep in mind, professionals with state credentials and counseling license, depending upon state regulations, are permitted and accountable for making substance use disorder diagnoses. It's something we should be doing. With this credential, we're looking at scope of practice and what is our responsibilities as clinicians. So someone who is credentialed to do this type of work, if you're seeing someone who has symptoms and we're going to talk about this shortly, but if they have the criteria to meet a substance use disorder, it's our ethical responsibility to make that diagnosis. You're going to want to look at the person, make a diagnosis, and make a recommendation. That's what in New Jersey, what Jane and I, the people we supervise, they do these assessments. So they have the credentials, and they're the ones meeting with people in the courts and deciding, do you have a disorder with any of the substances you're using? And if you do have one, what kind of treatment's indicated? So we also try to divert them to treatment. All right, so for those of you who aren't clinicians, for those that are, hopefully you've spent your money and bought the newest DSM-5. Now it's the TR. Every so many years, they have to update it so they could sell some more. Wasn't a lot of drastic changes in this section as far as substance use disorders, but this is the newest version. So what you're looking at is a problematic pattern of cannabis use leading to clinically significant impairment or distress. So this is an important part. Using a substance alone is not going to necessarily make you have a disorder. It has to be a problematic pattern and has to lead to clinically significant impairment or distress. And again, as manifested by at least two of the following, and I'm going to go down the list here, occurring within a 12-month period. So it's got to be a problem. It's got to lead to some type of impairment in your life. So the first one is cannabis is often taken in larger amounts or over a longer period than intended. So what does that mean? That's essentially loss of control. So you're looking at someone that, well, I really only wanted to have, one joint. The way I like to associate it a lot of times is drinking. People see it this way too. So it's, I wanted to have one beer, ended up having 4 or 5. It's, I only meant to go out for an hour or 2 after work and do something, but I came home at like midnight because I stayed out longer. So it's the idea that they can't control the amount of cannabis they're using. There's a persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control cannabis use. So they wake up saying, you know what, I really got to cut back on my use. Just even the desire alone, like I keep thinking about it, even if they don't take a step that would meet this criteria, or they've tried, okay, I'm going to cut back using, and then by the end of the week, they're right back to using more than they were planning on, or back to the use that they were trying to curtail and cut back on. So again, they can't control it. Great deal of time is spent in activities necessary to obtain cannabis, use cannabis, or recover from its effects. Is your cannabis use taking up a lot of time? I have to go to the dispensary. I have to, I'm using it multiple times throughout the day. So I'm under the influence. I'm really not able to do anything else for several hours out of the day. Is cannabis taking up a lot of your time? Cravings are a strong desire to use cannabis. So again, it's that craving, the thinking about it, the urges for it. Recurrent cannabis use resulting in a failure to fulfill major role obligations at work, school, or home. Having problems in school, did you get fired from a job? Are you not taking care of your kids? Is it affecting these areas of your life? Are there responsibilities that are not being met? Continued cannabis use despite having persistent or recurrent social and interpersonal problems, caused or exacerbated by the effects of cannabis. So a significant other telling you really got to stop doing this. Missing social events, it's impacting your social network. Important social, occupational, recreational activities. So playing basketball, this is important. We see this a lot with kids, like the younger kids in high school, giving up athletics. They're giving up after school activities. You're giving up other things that used to be important to you because cannabis is taking over priority. Recurrent cannabis use in situations which is physically hazardous. So obviously driving under the influence, later on, we'll talk about that a tiny bit, some of the concerns associated with it, but the idea that you're doing something under the influence, working construction, operating a forklift, any type of thing you're doing where your impairment could put you at risk or the people around you at risk. Cannabis uses continue despite a knowledge of having persistent or recurrent physical or psychological problems that is likely to have been caused or exacerbated by cannabis. We're going to talk about this a little bit later when we talk about withdrawal symptoms for it. You've got depression, you've got other anxiety. There's things that it's actually not making it better. It might be making it worse. Physical problems. Someone smoking marijuana, they have asthma. It's not making the asthma any better. It's the idea that it's going to make this worse. Or if your doctor even told you that, a doctor said you really need to cut back. You're like, yeah, but those cravings, those urges, I'm just going to go right back to doing it anyway. Knowing it's making something worse. Tolerance, kind of talk about that one. It's the idea that what you used to use is no longer getting you high, or even the matter that what you're using is not getting you as high as it used to. Your body's gotten used to it, and that requires more to get those effects that you really were looking for. Withdrawal, we're going to talk about a little bit further detail later, because it's an important one to take a look at. when we talk about people using cannabis and how's it going to impact their lives, how is it a bad thing? Well, we have to take a look at withdrawal symptoms and see how that's something that people are often overlooking. They don't see how many different things it can cause for people if they try to cut back or reduce their use. They're going to have withdrawal symptoms, and that's going to be something that's going to may lead to a little confusion for what they think is going on in their life.
I think it's important to note too, Emil, that with the withdrawal symptoms, that's a new addition for the DSM-5. It wasn't in prior versions of the DSM because the APA wasn't convinced that there actually were withdrawal symptoms for cannabis. So it's really good to see that got in there and that they expounded it just a little bit with the DSM-5 TR.
But no spoilers though. We have more details on that later.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. No spoilers.
You got to stick around.
Yeah. So, yeah. So for mild, you need 2 or 3 symptoms out of the 11 that Emil just talked about. For moderate, you need 4 or 5 symptoms. And if you have 6 or more, you have a severe cannabis use disorder. Does the DSM-5 consider medicinal marijuana use? That was something that we were very eager to get our DSM a few months ago and find out whether or not they actually expanded and considered medicinal use. Because as you know, if you read the DSM-5, with other substances such as sedatives, opioids, and stimulants, with those 3 drug categories, if someone has tolerance or withdrawal alone, and those are their only 2 symptoms, then you can't consider it a mild use disorder. They have to have something in addition to just the withdrawal and tolerance in order for it to be considered a use disorder. So we were eager to get the DSM and find out whether they had changed that with respect to cannabis. So I'm going to read these parts to you. Does DSM-5 TR consider medicinal use? When cannabis or a cannabinoid is taken as indicated for a medical condition, tolerance and withdrawal, physiological dependence may occur, but should not be the primary basis for diagnosing cannabis use disorder. The efficacy of cannabis for different medical conditions continues to be debated, and cannabis use as medically advised should be taken into account when a cannabis use disorder diagnosis is being made. Now, what you see in that is that it says it should not be the primary basis for diagnosis, but it doesn't exclude it like it does with the other substances, with the sedatives and the opioids. And they go on to say that it's still being debated whether there is efficacy with the use, with the cannabis. So they don't take that firm stand with cannabis like they do with the opioids and the stimulants and the sedatives. So if withdrawal and tolerance are among the criteria, can the diagnosis still be made? Yes, it can. Yes, it can. You can diagnose it as mild if it has only the 2. You can also use those 2 criteria if they're maybe among 3 or 4 others, and you can get a moderate or a severe diagnosis, and you can include all of the criteria, including tolerance and withdrawal. DSM did not rule those out. This criteria is not considered to be met for those taking the other substances, as we talked about, but with cannabis, they didn't take that stand. So, in our next slide, we want to look at a couple of hypothetical examples. And the first one we're going to look at is hypothetical with medicinal use. We saw these hypothetical cases we actually saw coming up within our work with the substance abuse counselors we work with. So we wanted to bring that to light and show you what we do, and also what is best practice, really. This client has a history of substance or cannabis use disorder, along with a PTSD diagnosis, and that came up in Dr. Gonzalez's presentation, claiming that their medicinal marijuana is now used as prescribed and necessary for mental health treatment. And he did a nice job explaining that. So we'll look a little further into detail. There's no guidelines for prescribing by physicians, first off. So that's the first problem with saying they're taking it as prescribed, is that, first of all, it's not a prescription. And second of all, there's no prescribing guidelines for physicians to use. Marijuana is technically not a prescription because it's not FDA approved. It's only authorized, or whatever language your state is using, which I believe is also authorized. Most clients select their own strains and they self-prescribe the frequency and amounts that they're using. Therefore, as prescribed is not valid. Confer with the client's physician, and we've done that quite a bit, reaching out to the doctors to determine if there's a planned regimen. How much are they supposed to be using? What are they supposed to be using for strains? How often? Even then, there's no way to determine adherence, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. So even if the client's physician says, this is what I'm recommending for them, there's no way to prove for sure that that's actually what they're doing, because it's too accessible in other ways. What we want to do as clinicians, we want to conduct a comprehensive assessment. Qualified clinicians, you're all clinicians here today, of the current level of severity of use, which are the criteria that Emil just went through, using the DSM-5 TR, and also get collateral information. So don't just go by off of what they say. Reach out to family members, reach out to if they have a probation officer, if there's a physician, someone that you can reach out to get collateral information about their use and whether or not their use is impacting them. Why do we want to do that? We want to do that because not because people are necessarily being dishonest, but they may not even yet know or realize the impact that their use is having on their life and on other people around them. So we want to get that collateral information, and that's allowed in the DSM. Collateral is allowed both in the DSM and the ASAM for making a diagnostic impression, a diagnosis, and for determining a level of care for treatment with ASAM. And as Emil mentioned earlier, before you look at any of the criteria, you've got to have the problematic pattern of use. And if you don't have that, you don't have a diagnosis. If a diagnosis can be made, despite the legal and medicinal use, treating this client's substance use disorder would include treating their cannabis use disorder. So we're not going to ignore the cannabis use disorder. We're going to treat it right alongside whatever other diagnosis they have. If they have a history of cannabis use disorder, they've been severe in the past, and now they're telling you, oh no, I'm taking it only as medicinal. You want to make sure that there's not other criteria going on. Determine the level of care in ASAM, American Society of Addiction Medicine criteria, and whether or not they're eligible for participation in your program. And we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about why, on the next slide, why that could be an issue. Confer with their physician. As we said, of course, you're getting proper consent through 42 CFR, making sure you have permission to talk to their doctor, asking whether there's other non-psychoactive medications. Now, you might be surprised how often there are, or they haven't tried something, or as soon as they hear from you, they say, yeah, you know what? Let me see if we can try this instead. And they try something that's not psychoactive instead of using the cannabis. If the physician determines that medicinal marijuana is the only effective option, then you have the need to determine whether or not the client is eligible for participation in your program while continuing on the medicinal marijuana. And our next bullet here tells us why that might be an issue. If we look at level of care, if they're in an outpatient program, that may not be an issue. But if they're in needing residential treatment, that might be an issue, because if it's federally funded, and most of the inpatient programs do receive federal funding, then you can't. They are not allowed to continue using medicinal marijuana in a residential program, because the program would be at risk for losing their federal funding. So they're going to need to consider whether they want treatment or whether they want to continue using the medicinal marijuana, if in fact residential is what they need and the outpatient is not an option. If there's a current diagnosis that can be made and there's no symptoms within the past 12 months, then according to DSM-5 TR, they're in sustained remission from their cannabis use disorder. And Dr. Gonzalez did mention that also, that you might have someone who's in a sustained remission from other substances, but maybe they're using medicinal cannabis alongside that, and in that harm reduction approach that he mentioned. Hypothetical with recreational use, there you're going to see a lot of parallels here. The person has a history of substance use or cannabis use disorder and is claiming to obtain cannabis through legal purchases for recreation. Recreation's legal in your state, recreational use. First of all, we don't know where the cannabis is really being purchased, but we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Alcohol is also legal for recreational use by adults, yet 10% of Americans have an alcohol use disorder and can't drink in safety. Marijuana is no different. And I appreciated what Lawrence shared right at the start, where he was talking about your state having the highest number of alcohol deaths in the country. That is really scary. We tend to think of alcohol as benign, And people also think of cannabis as benign. They don't realize that there is a lot of harm that can be done. So if we think of cannabis along the lines of alcohol, we've got a good parallel that we could use for determining recreational use safety. Comprehensive assessment, once again, even if a person's using recreationally, doesn't mean they don't have a problem. The same as with alcohol. A lot of people do have a problem. So we want to look at that. We want to see if they meet any of the 11 DSM criteria, and if they do in fact have a problematic pattern of use prior to looking at that criteria. If so, just like with the medicinal use, we're going to consider the level of treatment that they need. And we're also going to consider the fact that some providers, and maybe you're out there and you have stopped testing for cannabis because you're thinking, well, there's nothing I can do with it. It's recreational, it's medicinal. So why am I even testing for it? But there are reasons that we want to test for it, which we'll talk about in a little while. You also want to consider there again, if they need residential, you may not be able to get them into treatment if they're going to continue recreational use. In our next slide, if a diagnosis can be made with recreational use, there again, you're treating the use disorder right alongside the disorder of any other substance. If a diagnosis for cannabis use disorder is in remission, then you're going to consider then no symptoms. The client, since if there's no symptoms in the past 12 months, then the diagnosis is in sustained remission. And we want to make note of that. You see the parallels between both illicit use, as well as recreational use, as well as medicinal use. And why is that? Because the brain doesn't care where the substance is obtained from. It doesn't care whether it's legal or not legal. It's not about the legality. It's about whether or not there's a problematic pattern. And the brain doesn't distinguish how you got it.
Okay, so let's take a look at some studies. I think this one in particular is useful for when we're looking at why we're prescribing or why doctors may be prescribing medicinal marijuana. As we said, well, not prescribing, giving them permission slips for obtaining their medicinal marijuana. But let's take a look at this. So this study took a look at 269 adults. They split them in half. They asked half the group to wait 12 weeks before they receive their medicinal marijuana card. So hold off, we're going to have you wait and let the other people have it now. What they found was those who received the medicinal marijuana card after 12 weeks were 2 times more likely to develop cannabis use disorder. 10% of the medical marijuana card group had developed substance use disorders, cannabis use disorder diagnosis, with the number rising to 20% in those seeking a card for anxiety or depression. Now let's put a pin in that one. Anxiety or depression were the ones that had a 20% increase in the chances of developing a diagnosis for a cannabis use disorder. So there's been a lot of claims that medicinal marijuana for treating pain, insomnia, anxiety, depression, but there's not a lot of evidence supporting it. So we see here people with pain, anxiety, or depression, symptoms fail to report any improvement. So they're taking something thinking it's going to help this whatever disorder they may have said that's going to treat it, but they're not seeing improvement. The only one that appeared to have some improvement were those with insomnia. They reported experiencing improved sleep. So we're also going to put a pin in that one for later on when we start talking about withdrawal symptoms, because you want to put that in the frame of what that also could be associated with. So again, we're looking at people who are getting a card for whatever medical conditions they may be getting it for, thinking it's going to help improve these conditions. And I know Dr. Gonzalez also touched on this too, talking about what we're using it to treat, and is there any evidence showing that it's improving these conditions? Well, again, this is a little study showing these people waited, these didn't, but what do we have happening? Those that got the card developed a substance use disorder diagnosis for a cannabis use disorder. So if we're not improving what we're saying it's trying to treat, but now we're also adding a new condition to the mix, I'm not sure what we're really trying to accomplish with this. Okay, so I told you to put a pin in this one. People seeking cannabis for anxiety and depression is the most common condition. So we find that in New Jersey too, when we have patients coming in, they're talking about, oh, I get it for anxiety, I'm getting it for depression. But remember, on the previous slide, we talked about they were 20% higher for getting that. They had more of a chance of getting a cannabis use disorder for the ones most likely seeking it. So we have to keep that in mind. And as Jane was just talking about, the idea that most of these people are getting it from not their regular physician. They're getting it from a cannabis doctor or someone that, just does these cards for people. what do we see if you normally go to your primary care doctor? There's follow-up care, there's explanation on the medications, there's an actual amount. And as we're seeing, that's not how the system's been operating. If people are going in, choosing which products they want, they go to their, I believe one of the terms they use for them in New Jersey is they call them bud tenders. So that's the nice medical treatment they're getting. They're going into one of the dispensaries and speaking to a bud tender, and they're going to make recommendations for different strains. And I always find it interesting when, again, we're talking about this is for medical purposes. They have Death Star strain, Purple Haze. I don't know any other medications out there that use this kind of language and let you pick and choose which ones you want and how you want to dose it. I just find the system very interesting. But as we're saying here, if we're talking about treating certain conditions, this is not showing it's actually helping. What really needs to happen for this industry, if they really want to try to show there is benefit for the purposes they're saying they're using this for people, is that need much stronger safeguards over the dispensing, use, and follow-up. Really need to have that going on. It's going to be for medical conditions. We need to show efficacy, which, as we're seeing just from this one study right here, we're talking about, you're not seeing the efficacy other than helping with insomnia, people reporting improved sleep, everything else showing no improvement. So we want to keep these things in mind when we're looking at it as, okay, this is someone getting their prescription, this is medical purposes, so it's going to help with these conditions. Not necessarily the case if we're not seeing the evidence to back it up. Now we're going to talk about withdrawal. Survey across 2 years, 527 Michigan residents. So let's look at the different withdrawal symptoms people develop. Now, this is very common. 15 different withdrawal symptoms: cravings. That seems pretty common, cravings for cannabis. Anxiety. So what do we talk about? Anxiety is one of those reasons people get the medication. So this is a withdrawal symptom. Sleep difficulties, decreased appetite, restlessness, depressed mood, aggression, irritability, nausea, sweating, headache, stomach pain, strange dreams, increased anger, and shakiness. So when you have someone that's now taking cannabis for whatever medical reasons, as I said, anxiety, that's one of those, anxiety and depression were those ones that were the most common reason people get it. So they're taking their medicinal cannabis, and now they're like, okay, I want to try cut back and use a little less. Well, what's going to happen if they start to cutting back? They're going to start developing sleep difficulties. So it helps with insomnia. Well, if you're taking it and you don't have any withdrawal symptoms, when I stop taking it, my insomnia comes back. Or the same thing with depression and depressed mood and anxiety. So I'm going to stop. See, it came back again. It must have been working because now I'm having these symptoms that it was treating. They're coming back. So we need to keep that in mind too. A lot of clients are not educated on this. So people are getting their medicinal marijuana cards. They're going to these dispensaries. They're not getting this education. So we really have to make sure people are informed on withdrawal symptoms do happen. As Jane mentioned, the DSM's updated. Now we're recognizing there are symptoms people are going to have if they try to cut back and or just discontinue use. Okay, so withdrawal symptoms again. So this is just looking at percentages. So we have 41% experience mild, 34, 25%. So there's a range of people experiencing these symptoms. But what we need to keep in mind is, especially the third bullet point here, patients may mistakenly think symptoms are due to their underlying medical conditions. An increased amount of frequency of use to try to counteract the effect. What happens? Leads to this cycle of increasing use and increasing withdrawal. So it creates this vicious cycle of, okay, well, I had a condition I was going to treat this with. I'm taking it. I try to cut back use. Symptoms seem to be getting worse. So I'm going to use more. It creates this vicious cycle of either creating the problem or making the problem worse. So some people report experiencing significant benefits medical cannabis. So we hear anecdotally people saying that it's helping me, I'm doing better. But our findings suggest a real need to increase awareness about the signs of withdrawal symptoms developing to decrease the potential downside of cannabis use. So we really need to work on educating clients on this. For those that are getting it, it would be really great if these doctors giving out the cards and signing off on the paperwork really spent a little time explaining this to the client so they would get the better understanding of what may happen if you reduce using. If you try to cut back, these things may be happening and may be unrelated to an underlying medical condition. Could be the sole result of a cannabis use withdrawal symptoms. Okay, so let's move on to this next thing. So as Lawrence mentioned, we met him at the National Association of Drug Court Professionals. So interesting, Back in 2013, NADCP released a position statement on medicinal marijuana. I'm just going to read this and then read their current position. Because back when they released it then, it was very interesting how, how times were much simpler then and people were much more direct on how they viewed things. NADCP has long been committed to guiding the drug court field and the broader criminal justice treatment communities with science, not ideology. After thoroughly reviewing the research regarding the safety of recreational marijuana use and the efficacy of medical marijuana, NADCP equivocally stands against the legalization of marijuana and the use of smoked marijuana as medicine. Our reasons for doing so are thoroughly explained and cited in the attached position statement. So we found it very interesting. Back then, Jane, I think you said, I don't know if she still does, she used to have it hanging up, the little article where it came up, she had it hanging up on her cubicle wall for a while, because she felt like they took a bold stand back then. Now, as of 2022, we spoke to Terrence actually when we were doing this presentation. So they've shifted their position. So now NADCP has chosen not to weigh in on the debate over the efficacy of medicinal marijuana, as is outside NADCP's scope. So it's medicine. This is not what NADCP is about. We leave that to the professionals outside the scope. Follow your state laws and precedents unless you have federal grants that impact service delivery. So Jane mentioned that issues with placing people in treatment. They're receiving federal funds, may have some problems with placement. So that could be an issue. Treat cannabis as you would any other mood-altering substance being used medicinally. Make physicians aware of the substance use disorder with required releases. Clinicians monitor for presence and/or development of cannabis use disorder. Much more clinically focused how they're viewing it now. Talk to the doctors, monitor for use disorder. We don't ignore someone taking. I had this over the years. I'd have clients refer back when I work in a hospital setting. Their doctors were prescribing them Percocets, any type of opioids, but they were drinking. So they'd be sent to me because the doctor was worried they might have an alcohol use disorder. So we'd work on that and just kind of keep an eye on the opioid use disorder potentially developing, because we know it's common. Those things happen when you are used to abusing one substance that's minor mood altering. Take something else that can be, you have to watch that very closely. We wouldn't treat cannabis any different just because there's a card and they have permission slip for doing it or a prescription. You still monitor for any of those criteria we talked about for the DSM-5, now TR. You look for problematic patterns. Is it causing problems in their life? If there's not any sort of social impact, if there isn't any sort of loss of control, well, then is that something we're going to monitor for? Sure. But if those signs aren't there, we look for it for the other areas of their life. So if it's not a problem, we just watch it. We educate and make sure clients are aware. Again, I think those withdrawal symptoms are really important for people to be really educated on, because I think that there's a lot of, they just don't see it. I stop using it, my health condition comes back. It may not necessarily be that. So we really have to be mindful of that. And really, education is key.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, Emil. And I noticed, 2 slides back when you showed the percentages of withdrawals. Would you mind just popping back to that real quick? When you showed the percentages of withdrawal on that top line,
Yep.
I guess it's not too early for math, even in mountain time. But if you notice that top line, that adds up to 100%. So we can expect 100% of our clients to have withdrawal symptoms from cannabis. That's really important, as you're saying, because people do associate it with, they don't know whether if you ask the average marijuana user, do you experience withdrawals? They're going to say no. And yes, in fact, they do. And the other part that I wanted to comment on was that the difference between 2013 and 2022 with the National Association of Drug Court Professionals. When you're reading research, I would encourage you to not go back further than a couple of years. If you're looking at cannabis research, the research has changed drastically. And we were talking, it's been mentioned a couple times already today, because of the legalities behind doing research on cannabis. It's getting a little bit easier now to do the research. So a lot of it was anecdotal rather than actual research. So if you look at something, say from 2018, they may talk about all these benefits of cannabis use. And you look at the very similar parallels, and Emil's going to show you one in a little bit, where the results are totally different. That now things they thought were beneficial for, now it's not. Now they're proving it's not. And the anxiety depression studies, where some of the were some of those where, and I know someone asked a question this morning that they thought it was helpful for PTSD. And in the old research, it looked that way, but current research, it's not. So our second objective, look at an overview of the medical and psychological conditions for which different states allow the use of medicinal cannabis and current recreational practices. So this jumps right into our current objective. What kind of issues does that raise in practice? Well, first of all, for what conditions are clients eligible for medicinal marijuana, and are there actual benefits? So when you read a research article, don't read just the top title, read the whole thing to see whether or not there was actually a benefit to it. Second bullet is medicinal marijuana approved as an MAT, and does cannabis reduce opioid overdose deaths? And lastly, what does drug testing tell us? So this is your list for New Mexico of authorized conditions, and you have 28 of them. There's most states don't have quite this many. So I was looking at, I think we're up to around 18 or something like that in New Jersey, but you folks do have those, have quite a bit. And it's nice that your Department of Health went through the trouble of putting them in alphabetical order. So we're up to O on this slide. And if you can skip to the next slide, we got the rest of the alphabet done. If you have a client who has issues and it's not on this list, they allow you to actually petition for a qualifying condition. So if the patient does not have a qualifying condition and they still believe, the doctor still believes medicinal marijuana would benefit them, they can petition the medical advisory board to actually make whatever condition is a qualifying condition. You will notice opioid use disorders on there, and we're going to touch on that a little bit more.
I'm just going to point that one out. That's an important one to notice. Opioid use disorder. It's
as you mentioned, put a pin in it. Yep. Okay. So on our next slide, this, if you want to know what's going on in any of the other states around you, and I know you have, I believe, 5 border states, this is a really good link to look up what's happening currently with respect to the legislation. So you can know whether client CBD is allowed, whether it's allowed medicinally or whatever. You definitely don't want to be in South Carolina or Idaho. Anything orange, there's nothing legal at all. So the darker the colors, the more legal. CBD's all gray. And this particular map is real good information, a way to stay up to date on what's happening across the nation. It's an interactive map, which is why yours is in blue. When I clicked it on, it came up with your information. You can actually look up your laws and laws in any other state. Just by clicking on the state, it'll pull it up for you. So what does research say about the substance? What actually is medicinal marijuana? Is it safer? Is it more, what is it? It's the same product, recreational and street marijuana. It's the same product. Marijuana plant contains over 100 different chemical compounds called cannabinoids. Delta-9 THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, and cannabidiol are the 2 main chemicals used in medicine. THC is, of course, the one that gives you the high. The cannabidiol does not give you the high, the CBD. The FDA doesn't oversee medical marijuana, much like the general nutrition centers and place that over-the-counter products, health store supplements. Those are not regulated by the FDA. The FDA also doesn't regulate medicinal marijuana because it's not a prescription drug. And most states don't have the resources to monitor it, even with good intentions, and it might be part of the law. When it comes down to it, a lot of times the states don't have the resources to spend going out, testing the different strains, testing the different products, making sure that they're actually containing what they say they're containing. And the strength in the ingredients depend a lot on where you purchase it and what the different compounds are. What's on the label doesn't have to be what's in the product because it's not being federally regulated. There's no one to prove it. Out at the University of Penn, they did a study with respect to pulling in brownies, lollipops, a lot of edibles from California and Washington. And what they found is that few of the products had anywhere near what was on the label. Very dangerous for our clients because they don't know what they're getting. Next slide. Continuing on, what is it? conditions researchers are studying for possible medical marijuana use. There's quite a lot of them, and I'll let you read those yourself. Anywhere from Alzheimer's, wasting syndrome. There's a lot of conditions being looked at. All the ones that are on your approved list, those are also conditions that do need to be looked at because they're not proven. Then there's only been a couple conditions that have been proven to benefit from cannabis. The greatest benefit is with respect to chemotherapy. For people that have cancer and they're getting chemotherapy, with the pain, the nausea, the vomiting, and muscle stiffness, muscle spasms. But the only thing the FDA has actually approved them for is dronabinol and nabinolone, which they've approved for. Those are CBD products. They're not THC products. And it's very important to distinguish that it's not THC that's been proven to benefit these conditions. It's the CBD that's been shown to benefit. And it's the CBD that's the only one that's approved medicine. So the FDA's only approved it for cannabinoids for 2 rare and severe conditions of epilepsy, the Epidiolex that Dr. Gonzalez mentioned this morning, and that's approved for 2 different forms of epilepsy. And again, that's a CBD product. It's not a THC product. Our resources, by the way, are in the footnotes, which you may have noticed. So if you do decide you want to look anything up, feel free.
Yes. We give a lot of the top line kind of, we read the long research things to give you the answers that we think you're looking for and need. But the research I always recommend, as Jay mentioned earlier, whenever you see research studies out there, you want to take a look at them for yourself, look at the fine print, read the conclusions. A lot of times the top line headlines of things doesn't always match fully what the actual research shows. Here in the case of this one, so this one is the relationship between chronic pain and changes in health with cannabis consumption patterns. So again, what we talk about is what actually we're looking at. What are the results we're seeing? Is what we're claiming we're treating, what disorder we're treating, is it working? Is it helping? So this study took a look at for chronic pain. So what they're looking at people with low levels of pain, people with more higher levels of pain, and their use patterns. What they found is people who have low pain, they tend to use less, which makes sense. But they also, in a 12-month study, when you look at them later on, they reported no improvements in their health conditions. So if we're saying it's going to help their pain and what they're dealing with, and they're reporting in low pain categories did not make any difference for them, then it's really not treating or not accomplishing what we're hoping it's going to accomplish. But what we're seeing is with people with more higher levels of pain, they're using more. And what do we know happens when someone's using more cannabis? As we talked about earlier, you're seeing the more someone's using, you're going to see more of these possible cannabis use disorder symptoms develop. It's going to have more of an impact in their life. But they also noted that, and I'm going to go to the next slide just to give it kind of the follow-up to it, that they're reporting their health getting worse. So you have someone who has a serious pain condition, they're using marijuana and now they're using more of it than someone with a lower level of pain, and they're reporting their health is getting worse. So I don't see how at that point we're showing any sort of improvements in their situation by adding one more thing in their life, which is cannabis, when that also will lead to them developing a cannabis use disorder, which is now a new problem. Generally, we don't like treating conditions by giving someone another condition to have to deal with. So let's take a look at this. So there is a complex relationship between pain, marijuana use, and self-reported health. So they did acknowledge that someone who already had a serious health condition in the first place, I mean, you could expect that their health may be getting worse over the course of the year, regardless of the marijuana use or not. But what we have to take a look at is, again, it may not be the pain that the patients are trying to address. We may be using cannabis trying to treat this chronic pain for somebody, and it's not working for their particular situation. So again, it's targeting what is our goal. Our goal is to try to improve someone's life, whatever the condition may be, making it better. This is clearly showing that's not the case. When you've got one, low-level pains, not showing any change. It's not improving anything for them. Higher level pain, using more, pushing them into more likelihood of developing a cannabis use disorder, and their health is still getting worse anyway. So that is not in any medical model how we look to do practice. So we just want to keep that in mind, because it's been very common. We think we're going to use it for treating chronic pain. That's not the case. We're not seeing the results in any of the studies. You got to look at the research. As Jane mentioned, you particularly want to look at stuff that's more recent, but you may see stuff from the past, and we're going to touch on that in a little bit. talking about how this clearly shows it's doing much better. But when you look at current research, it's not adding up. It's not really showing the results that people think it, or people kind of assume nowadays that yes, it's going to help with pain. No, it's not. So let's look at MAT. So that's one of those things everyone who works in this field should be aware of. So for opioids, you have buprenorphine, methadone, naltrexone, alcohol, acompensate, disulfiram, and naltrexone. What's not on that list? Cannabis. Cannabis isn't on that list. So it's not eligible. We know obviously the FDA considerations is a Schedule I drug, so it's not going to be approved as an MAT because of that. Cannabis is authorized by different states for different medical conditions. Jane reviewed a lot of those for your particular state. Every state has their own things that may be approved, except for those four orange ones that Jane noted. State laws may allow cannabis to be used alongside it as an MAT as one of the conditions for which cannabis is authorized, which is interesting because, as we noted, opioid use disorder is one of those conditions on the list. So in New Mexico, technically, it could be used for cannabis, can be prescribed for an opioid use disorder, but this does not make it an MAT. So even though you may be using it to treat according to approved conditions in your state, it's not indicated for that. So let's look at this. So Jane mentioned looking at recent research. 2014 research claimed medicinal marijuana lowered opioid overdose rates, leading some states to conclude its effectiveness as a medication in the fight against opioid addiction and overdose. Is that assumption valid? Well, this is why it's important. A lot of that stuff was based on studies from 1999 to 2010. When you looked at the data then, comparing states that had medicinal marijuana, some that had some recreational, so they had some level of cannabis being available in a legal way. They appeared at that point, their overdose rates were lower. So looking at that data alone, if you're just not digging into the data behind it, just looking at the sheer numbers, you had states that had restrictions on it and those that had some level of cannabis being available, whether it's medicinal, recreational, some scale of that, their overdose rates were lower. Now, if you take that study and move it from 2010 all the way through to 2017, that's where this last study ended, it became very clear from the data that was no longer the case. So there was a big difference, particularly by 2014, when you're looking at the data. That's where they unfortunately didn't take a look and update it. But by 2014, the data showed the opposite. It went from 21% lower rate of overdose to a 23% higher rate of overdose in states that had some level of cannabis being, whether medicinal or recreational. So when you look at it that way, it's not getting us the results we were thinking. Now, there were some factors to add to it. Obviously, fentanyl came into the system, was one of those things that really, we saw a huge spike in overdose for everyone. But one of the things we're looking at that probably most likely relates to it, and this makes sense, the states that had some level of legality for cannabis being available, most of those states had different criminal justice system laws. So you're looking at states that had, as you describe it nowadays, maybe a more progressive way of viewing the criminal justice system. So less likely to incarcerate people for low-level offenses, because we know if you incarcerate people, for anyone that's been following NADCP, they really talk about this when it came to overdose, is looking at someone who's incarcerated, you're lowering their tolerance, you're increasing their chances when they come out when they use to overdose. So ways of the criminal justice system functioning in some of those states was a factor in it. They were less likely to incarcerate people. If you're not incarcerating people, you're not going to see those overdoses right out of incarceration. Those places also had a lot more naloxone availability, treatment program availability. So there was other factors that more likely were the reason why they had initially lower overdose rates. Now it leveled out because all the states, New Jersey's got Narcan training. Everyone's well aware of Narcan. Criminal justice system have changed across the country much more towards diversion, trying to get people treatment instead of incarcerating them. So that's why we've seen it shift differently. But now what we're seeing is, as I said, those states have a higher rate of overdoses compared to the states that don't have that range of cannabis availability. So is it making it better now, or is now we're seeing it potentially making it a higher risk in those states? Further data needs to be looked at and further research is necessary, but that's not the fix anymore. That push for treat opioid use disorders with cannabis, that's going to be the fix. Let's reduce opioid prescriptions. That's clearly, the data does not support that. As of 2017, it's been very clear that doesn't support it anymore.
Okay, so let's take a look at what drug testing tells us. Questions that this looks at in practice. We have a few questions we're going to give a look to. How do we know whether they're buying on the street or buying from a dispensary? State medical marijuana databases and some of the states, you could actually look up and find out whether or not a person is buying from a dispensary or whether they're not. I know that from talking with Dominic, that New Mexico doesn't have that right now, that you're not allowed to look up and find out whether or not a person is actually using medicinally. Dr. Gonzalez mentioned about a prescription drug monitoring program, which would include medicinal marijuana. And if you did have that, you could look up to see whether someone was actually buying from the dispensary. The thing is that what you don't know is whether or not they're supplementing it with illicit cannabis as well as just buying it from the dispensary. So there's really no way to tell. But if we look realistically and we're real about it, street cannabis is cheaper. Clients already know who sells it. The quantities aren't limited by regulations. Access is easier, no transportation required, especially for those rural cities. Dealers are open 24/7 and the process is familiar to them. So where do we think they're getting it? It's very unlikely they're going to the dispensary. So maybe a little cynical on my part, but I think I've been around addiction long enough to know that. The second thing we want to look at is, how do I know if they're positive or high? There's been a lot of work with that as well. New Jersey was supposed to incorporate some type of a program where they were actually going to train professionals to go out, maybe to workplaces, and decide whether someone was positive or high so that they could implement work policies. That hasn't happened yet. So I'm not sure how that's ever going to come about. What you want to do basically is look for signs of impairment and keep the person safe. If they're positive or they're high, just make sure that they're not impaired and that they're safe with what they're doing, and respond accordingly. And if we do have a couple of questions in the chat, I don't know if Emil, if you want to jump in with them, or should we finish this segment? But that's okay with me. Either way, you can jump
I don't
in.
know if we have an answer. Oops, I saw two pop up real quick.
Okay.
So Delta 8 is being tainted and sold in vape smoke shops. Any info on Delta 8? We don't have any of it included in here.
Right. We could get you some though. We do have information on Delta 8. We just don't have it in these slides.
Next question, is there any information on cannabis helping reduce alcoholism?
Ooh, no.
I've not seen any.
No, that's a great question though. I like that. And if you've been in the field for a little while, we talk about gateway substances a lot, and cannabis was actually looking at as not so much a gateway with opioids use disorder and other addictions, but as an exit drug. If someone was using opioids and they had an opioid use disorder, or they had an alcohol use disorder, could we let them use cannabis instead? And then that way it would reduce the alcohol use disorder or the opioid use disorder. And I don't have any research that says it does that. Anecdotally, I can tell you from experience that if cannabis was enough, they never would have moved to the other substances. So it's a little bit. Go ahead.
I think a lot of it is it's the shift in harm reduction thinking and what's the best way to reduce the amount of harm they can do. I will say a long time ago, way back when alcohol and during post-prohibition days, it was the idea of like, no, what was better than someone being drunk and like maybe violent on the streets was, oh, let's give them some type of opioid. So we've seen these shift in ways of thinking what's the best way to reduce the harm someone may do for themselves. And as Jane said too, I've not seen any of the research out there supporting if you someone's going to shift over to cannabis instead. Even when you look at with Percocets and trying to reduce opioid prescriptions, giving someone cannabis instead, when it comes to extreme pain, the research shows if it's significant pain, it's not that they're going to replace their opioid prescription. They're going to give them as it's an auxiliary thing, something addition. So they're using cannabis and then they're also using the opioid prescription. And what we find is all the research is really supporting if you combine the two, there's a greater chance a person's going to misuse their opioid prescription. So for severe chronic pain, it's the results are not, it's not showing it for that. Alcoholism, I've not seen anything, as Jane's saying. It's the idea of mind and mood altering substances. When the brain becomes hijacked and wired for that, you stimulate it with another substance. for those working in this field know that it's not a good result when that happens. It's only a matter of time for most people. It's going to lead back to a problem.
And I think that ties in with the next question that's in the chat: is marijuana use safer than opioid use for pain? And neither cures the pain, but knowing several people that have overdosed on pain medication. And as Emil was just saying, people don't switch. And there was a huge research study done with Medicaid about 5 years ago. And they identified at first that there was less opioid use going on when there was pain, when there was cannabis being prescribed. But what they didn't show, and they couldn't show, was that the people actually switched substances. And when they researched further and looked further into the databases, they found that, as Emil just said, people were using both. They weren't switching. So let's see, being that cannabis is a Schedule I classification and not legal at the federal level, does this not make research difficult? Exactly. That is exactly the problem with why it makes research difficult. You have to actually apply for special funding and special variances, as universities do, to be able to do cannabis research, and not everyone gets it. So they have to prove what they're going to be doing, and they have to apply for it to be able, and I forget what the waiver actually is called, but they have to apply for special federal waivers in order to be able to do cannabis research, which is, now there's more of it going on, which is why we are saying, look at the current research and things that are within the last 2 or 3 years, not things that go back further, because that research was not necessarily done to standards.
What you'll also see is a lot of the research that we're going to cite, it's going to be based on reports of people in states that have access to it, that have medicinal marijuana. They could do studies based on the patients in those states. So reporting someone's being treated with chronic pain, they also have a medicinal marijuana card. So that kind of data gathering is going on. The actual doing research and lab-based stuff, it's, as Jane said, there are going to be restrictions on that, but they can gather information. There's people, clearly, there's also plenty of people who, even without medicinal marijuana, getting it through that system, you can do surveys of clients. There's a lot of information that can be gathered, and you can do follow-up studies based on whatever thing you're targeting.
And I see a question on overdosing on cannabis, and we have about a couple slides on that in about a few minutes down the road. So thank you for that. Thank you for these great questions. Okay, so what does drug testing tell us? I need to close my chat so that I can see my screen better. Okay, what does drug testing tell us? Let's continue with that. Maybe they're just doing CBD and it tests positive for THC. Who knows? That could be it. Maybe it's just showing up as THC. Pure CBD won't make you test positive for THC on a drug screen. Now, why does that happen? That researchers have found that CBD did not react with drug screening tests. However, most of the time, what people are buying is not pure CBD. The researchers use pure CBD when they do their research, but what someone's buying for CBD in the stores is not necessarily pure CBD. So that could actually contain THC, and probably does. And that's why they're testing positive. So they go out with good intent, buy CBD, thinking that it's pure CBD, and in fact, it's got THC laced in with it. CBD and CBN are two of many chemicals in cannabis plants. They differ from THC. CBD is present in marijuana, but more abundant in hemp. CBN is actually a THC derivative, and those are important because those two chemicals were involved in drug testing. The University of Utah, this researcher spiked different batches with CBD and CBN, different batches of urine, and then tested them to see whether or not they would test positive for THC. And what she found is that in some of the immunoassay screens, CBN did test positive for THC. CBD did not. So on our next slide, what does that mean for us with respect to drug testing? Is this immunoassays are only screens. They use antibodies. They're not that accurate. They're only intended to be a screen. So whenever someone has a positive, you want to send it back for a confirmation test. If that was sent for a confirmation test, it would have tested out that it wasn't THC the person was positive for, it was positive for CBN. So you always want to get a confirmation test. CBD just by itself will not test positive for THC. So we don't want our clients saying, no, I'm positive for THC. I know I'm not supposed to be smoking. I have a cannabis use disorder, but it's just the CBD. Well, no, it's not. It wouldn't test that way. CBD products are only supposed to be 0.3% THC. They can't have more than that, which won't show up in a drug screen. But unfortunately, there's no way to tell whether or not what someone's buying. Back in 2017, they did a study, and 7 out of 10 CBD products didn't contain the amount of CBD stated on the label, and 1 out of 5 actually had THC in it. So good thing to make our clients aware of. And as we noted earlier, you also always want to send it back for a confirmation test. Okay, so why drug test at all if we can't do anything about the cannabis use? If it's recreational, everything's legal, why are we drug testing for it at all? In medicinal users, we're testing for what should be there. They should have cannabis in their system, and we want to make sure it is in fact there, that they're not selling their cannabis and buying something else. Test results will factor in recreational users who are not supposed to be using. So if they're not supposed to be using because you're treating their substance use disorder, you want to make sure they're not using. Even though it's recreational, it's what we're looking for is a use disorder. Is there a DSM-5 diagnosis? So we still want to test for it because they might have a problem, even though it's legal. Cannabis positives, if you haven't seen the 8 Dimensions of Wellness, it's a good thing to download from SAMHSA's website. Cannabis positives alongside looking at how they're doing in their life. Really good criteria for looking at whether or not they've got a DSM diagnosis. And it's good help for your team. So won't their drug test levels tell us how much they're using? We hear this all the time. Providers are, well, or clients are, well, my provider and I are monitoring, my levels are coming down, so I must not be using. The levels don't mean anything as far as the use goes. There's too many other factors. So if you're saying someone comes in with a 200 and they're down to 100 the next week, so they must have stopped, not necessarily. It doesn't work that way. And someone who is a heavy user, it should be out of their system relatively quickly. It can stay in 30 days, generally doesn't. We've had people that were chronic heavy users, half ounce a day, and they're clean, completely clean, nothing left within a week. So the toxicology is a very tricky science. Even when with legal cannabis, there's different strains. People are using different amounts. So there's too many environmental factors that can come in to think that levels mean anything at all. And if you're not sure, there's a link on the bottom for a NDCI toxicologist by the name of Paul Carey. Really good information on drug testing.
We had one quick question you could probably answer.
Sure.
If THC may be found in CBD sold in the store, is there also a chance that the online stores and magazines who advertise CBD gummies contain THC as well?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Thank you for that question. Absolutely, because none of it's regulated. And it could well be easier that it's easier to get the cannabis plant than the hemp plant. So they may be not even making it from the hemp plant, which is what CBD is supposed to come from.
Yeah. So objective 3, be able to speak about the science of the impact of cannabis on the body, brain, and recovery, legal or not. Okay. Questions this objective raises in practice. What is the cannabis system? A lot of us will be probably pretty familiar for most people here. We've been hearing a lot about this. How does medicinal and recreational marijuana use impact recovery? How do clinicians respond to client statements about cannabis use as harmless? All right, CB1, CB2, we're probably very familiar with the receptors. So let's take a look at that. So CB1 in the brain controls the levels and activity of most of the other neurotransmitters. Well, excuse me. They regulate by immediate feedback, turning up or down the activity of the above functions as needed. So stimulate the receptor sites. The drug, our brain produces its own type of endocannabinoids in it naturally. The chemicals in marijuana mimic it. So we know that with all the substances out there that are mind or mood altering, they mimic something else in the brain that our brain naturally produces, and it affects how we respond. CBD2 is a little bit different. Resists mostly immune tissues and is critical in helping control immune functions. CBD2 plays a role in modulating intestinal inflammation. So we know that when we talk about Crohn's disease and irritable bowel conditions, contraction and pain and inflammatory bowel conditions. CBD2 receptors are targets of drug development because they don't cause the high associated with cannabis that stimulating the CB1 receptors cause. So we've got the CB1 receptors, the euphoria and the high associated with that. CB2 impacts a different area and doesn't have that high. So it's important to keep that in mind what we're targeting. All right, emergency rooms. This is no surprise. I'm sure people have been well aware of this. This is just particularly talking in Canada. But the thing we've seen when it becomes medicinal, when it goes to recreation, when it depends on what things are available in the marketplace, unfortunately, the more we get those edibles out there into the system, you see plenty more children accidentally using it, getting hospitalized, going to emergency rooms. Now, we're not going to see anyone overdose, but kids can be hospitalized and require ICU stays. So it's very important, whether it's medicinal or not, that kids can never be exposed to substances. We even talk about this for those that have ever attended any overdose trainings and you discuss MAT. We always say, keep the things secured properly in your home. Any prescription drugs you're taking, any recreational things you're using, nothing should be around children. It's become a huge problem though with the edibles. Again, when we look at any other substance that we're saying we're using for medicinal purposes, they don't make candies out of them really, except you're talking about maybe some pain lollipop things out there. Other than that, you're not finding any of the medications sold as little gummy bears that you can eat. That's not the way it operates. When you do that, there's an increased risk that children are going to come across it. And what do children do when they come across gummy bears? I mean, I'd be tempted to. I see some candy laying around. I'm a little tempted to have some candy sometimes. So you have to be very mindful of that. It's not this innocuous thing you don't have to worry about. Children are very vulnerable to it, and it can be very dangerous for them. Again, no overdoses, but cannabis poisonings is a problem for kids. You can cause some serious health issues for children. Okay, so same thing about pregnant women. I don't know if you've seen this. I've heard this. I've seen news articles on it. When you go, as I mentioned earlier, to one of these dispensaries, you're going to sit there and talk to one of the bud tenders and discuss what conditions you may be going there for. They'll recommend what strain or what particular one might be good for you. It has happened across the country where pregnant women have gone in and said, you know, I'm feeling some nausea from morning sickness. What strain can I have? Seriously, people will give it to them and people think it's just marijuana. It's no big deal. Okay, so what research has shown, problems include for women that use. So this is looking at 16 studies and 59,000 patients. So this is extensive research. Problems include small size, low birth weight, along with need to be admitted to neonatal intensive care units. Specifically, researchers saw a doubling of the odds for low birth weight, doubling. 28% higher odds for premature delivery, 38% higher odds that the baby would need NICU. The infants were also more likely to have a lower ACBAR score. For those that work in there, that's how healthy is the baby. There's a different scoring system they do for that, which assesses newborn's health right after birth. It's clear at this point, the research shows if you use marijuana while pregnant, there is an increase of negative outcomes. It's just very clear at this point. So thinking, oh, I could just have a little bit to help with my nausea and my morning sickness. It's clear. It's research shows it's not safe. Anytime you're doing it while pregnant, there's going to be harm done to the baby. So it's definitive at this point. There's no more. We're going to recommend it and say, no, it's just going to help your morning sickness. There'll be no negative side effects. It's clear.
I think we wanted to, Emil, before we go to that, we do want to mention that adults also can overdose on cannabis, the edibles.
Yes. Well, that's true. And Dr. Gonzalez, I think, mentioned that earlier with the, it's a hard word to say, that condition.
Hyperemesis, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
So yes, there could be significant effects from that.
And you also do have with the edibles, people ending up in emergency rooms, adults, not just kids, adults ending up in emergency rooms,
Absolutely.
taking the edibles or using strains that are higher, using too much. So people do overdose. Now, do people overdose and die? That's, I think, where sometimes we think people don't overdose on cannabis because they didn't die. But can you overdose and not die? Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yes, and I think Dr. Gonzalez also talked about the whole
Yeah.
edibles and how that has increased the problem for some people. You see the ER spikes also around the same thing, especially when it became recreational, and like Colorado, states that were the first to do it, became like a tourism industry. So you had, for those that like, oh, I've never used before, hey, why not? Now it's legal. I'm going to go in that state and try it. Inexperienced people where, you buy a cookie, on the back of the cookie, it says, eat 1/4 of this cookie for a dose. They don't realize that they eat a little piece of it. Oh, I don't feel any effect happening. Let me eat some more. They end up eating the whole cookie, and then they end up in the emergency room with a panic attack, feeling like their heart's racing. So yes, it can be harmful for adults also.
Yeah, and there's also a question in the chat, Emil, or comment. Tobacco companies got in a lot of trouble for advertising and products that targeted youth. Has the issue been raised with cannabis products and marketing, or have there been efforts to prevent marketing that appeals to youth?
I am not aware of any current things in the process, in the legal system, or challenges to it, but I agree. We remember that whole Joe Camel and that whole idea that it was making it young and hip and cool. I'm seeing similar things in this whole cannabis industry that's out there, that it seems targeted towards youth. So I would be surprised if at some point it doesn't happen, but yes, it seems to be targeted towards a younger generation. Here's another issue that we've clearly come up with. Field sobriety tests. How do you do this? We know marijuana may stay in the system longer, so just testing positive for THC, does that necessarily mean you are currently impaired? There's been a lot of work with the whole drug recognition expert training and how specific people are trained, or officers can go get training, and they'll come out and do the field sobriety test to tell if there's impairment. There's been a lot of issues with how objective that can be done. There might be some biases in the training. So it's really challenging to be able to find out if someone is impaired currently for THC. Some of the research has shown brain imaging scans could be one of those ways of doing it. Research, they're trying to work towards that, but there's no little equipment thing they can hook up to someone in the field to be able to tell if they're currently impaired that way. So they really are relying on, sure, we can do drug screens and they'll be positive, but they're really basing it off of the field sobriety testing things they do to be able to tell if they're currently impaired at this point, not that they just smoked marijuana yesterday and it's still left over in their system. So that's the challenge here. States have really been struggling with that. How are we really going to get this to accomplish whether someone's driving impaired or not based on THC? It's the issues of testing.
Okay, so a little bit about the sense of smell. Neuroscience makes it clear that smell and memory are very closely linked. And this is a concern that I have with respect to people who are in recovery and people who are trying to maintain recovery. Smells are handled in the nose, the olfactory bulb, and from there, messages are sent to other parts of the body that send messages to your body. Now, if you can think, for example, if you smelt smoke and you were in a building and you smelt smoke, that information would be sent to other parts of your body and other parts of your brain for processing. Message might be, get out of that building, it's on fire. Another pleasant memory might be you're thinking of something that you enjoyed as a child, a special food you like to eat, maybe a grandparent's house that you went to, and that particular smell would draw you closer. You'd want to come in and take part in that. The sense of smell is the strongest memory. And for that reason, odors in the brain in a very strong, they take on neuroimaging, intracranial research has been done to show that that's the strongest memory, is the sense of smell. So my concern with that is people who are in recovery or getting into recovery and they're in places where cannabis is being used, it's going to be a trigger. It's going to be a very strong trigger for them to draw them back to their old way that they're trying to leave behind.
And I know about you, but nowadays you could smell in any of the, around New Jersey, any of the cities you go through, it's everyone's smoking it out in the open because it's full recreational use. So that's, I could see that challenge for some of our clients that are living in these neighborhoods, smelling it as they walk by constantly.
Mm-hmm. This next slide is kind of just a little bit of a little bit humor, anecdotal humor. There's a person who wrote an article, and it's actually on the SAMHSA website, who talking about his, I think you called it California recovery or something like that in the early slides, where someone is using marijuana, but in recovery. And this person talks about how they have put away their opioid use and now they're just doing marijuana, a little bit of alcohol, but in the long run, they realize that's not what people would benefit most people. So they're very hesitant about making that kind of recommendation. So if you need a cute little article to pass on to clients, it might be a good resource. In our next slide. So we're going to give you a little, we've got a poll right now, and if Josh is with us here, because we all have these comments from clients about how marijuana is perfectly safe and what's our problem, what are we concerned about. So I want to ask you, when your client says to you something like, hold on, let me get my slide up here. It's all natural. It comes from God's green earth. Multiple choice responses you could choose for a little reality testing for them. So pick your favorite one. Are you this religious in all aspects of your life? Or might you say to them, the natural use for plants to oxygenate the air, not to roll it up and smoke it. Not all plants were made to be consumed. Or D, cannabis is not a green vegetable. So what's our poll here? What did we come up with?
So Jane, the polls are combined. So I have all three of them. So you'll get the results after all three.
Oh, fine. That's fine. Okay. So let's go on to our next question here, which is next part of the quiz. Client says to you, the brain contains cannabis receptors. So we were meant to use it. Multiple choice responses you might choose now that you've had all this science today to stump your client. The brain contains naturally occurring neurotransmitters that were named endocannabinoids, but these chemicals are not cannabis. Or B, ingested cannabis attaches to the brain's natural CB1 and CB2 receptors. These receptors were meant for CB1 and CB2, not for cannabis. C, cannabis is not a part of our brains. Cannabis hijacks and disrupts the brain's natural endogenous cannabinoid system, which regulates many critical body and brain functions. Or D, didn't you take science in school? And our third and last question that you might get from a client, it's perfectly safe. You can't overdose on it, so what's the harm? It isn't really even a drug. And we hear that a lot in the cities, in particular, urban areas. So you might shed some light for your client. A, let's talk about driving. How are your reaction times after using marijuana? B, children end up in the ER and hospitals from accidental ingestion. Newborns end up in the ICU as a result of their moms using during pregnancy. Does that sound safe? C, opioid overdose rates increase after states legalize cannabis. D, a substance other than food intended to affect the structure or function of a body. Dictionary definition of a drug. So if you throw in your poll responses, we'll see what you got. See what our favorites are.
Jane, do you see the results on your screen too? Do you have them?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll put them up when they slow down. Right now, it looks like a lot of folks are still answering.
Great. That's good. Thanks.
I think we're all, it looks like it's starting to level off.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it off in 30 seconds. If you're just trying to finish up, please finish. All right, 10 more seconds.
So
All
is
right,
that our final screen?
Yeah, those are the results being shared with the audience.
Okay, cool. So you can see, I guess most of you like not all plants are meant to be consumed. Cannabis is not part of our brains. And children end up in, very sad. Very sad. Thank you all for participating. You can
Yes,
feel
thank you,
free to
everybody.
plagiarize and choose whatever ones you want.
Okay, now Jane and I always like to make sure when people leave our presentations, and we're almost wrapping up here, we like to make sure people always have a positive feeling when they finish one of our presentations. So they'll go tell their friends, even if you don't remember anything we said, you'll say, I had a good feeling when I left their presentation. So for that, we have a little puppy falling asleep or had a little too much medicinal cannabis. This kitten looks like definitely a little too much. I think a little more of a paranoid reaction because whoop. Of course, a duck. We've got to keep some variety in all of our pets. So we've got those with dogs and kittens covered. Now we also have a duck for anyone who has a pet duck. And then we have a bear falling asleep, a little bear cub. So again, if your clients appear this way and they're saying, I'm taking my medicinal cannabis as prescribed, you're going to want to have a discussion with them that I think it's a little too much. Then, of course, if you want access to this PowerPoint, we are going to make it available. I think I don't know how we're going to handle it, emailing us. Our email addresses are here, so feel free to email us if you have any questions or any additional comments. At this point, I think we'll open it up if there's any additional questions that people can get a chance to ask, anything that you were hoping to learn from this presentation that maybe we didn't cover.
Thank you for all your questions so far. Lawrence, if there's anything you think you want to jump in with, feel free.
Thank you. Both excellent presentation. We'll just open it up for questions. We're doing good on time. So please put your question in the chat. I'm also going to
stop sharing my screen. I think everyone probably had a chance to get our email addresses if they need it. So I'll open it up. There you go. Thank you for there you go. Thanks, Lawrence.
So while people get the questions either on the chat, let's see here. Are you aware that ASAM and APA, American Psychological Association, do not endorse cannabis or medical marijuana? Are you aware of that, or
Is that a statement or a question? Because I don't think either one has taken a stand yet. The latest things that I've seen is they haven't taken a stand.
Okay, and that speaks volumes in terms of ASAM determination of level of care, that they haven't taken a stand, and also APA, that's probably a better way to put it, that they have not taken a stand, and especially with a lot of the states that are legalizing cannabis. I mean, from the, and I have to correct myself, from New Mexico's Administrative Office of the Courts, what is your experience in New Jersey or nationwide of individuals, participants in drug court? Is it a good thing that they're on cannabis or not? I mean, and I know that's a complicated question.
Emil, if you want to answer that, I just wanted to just clarify a little bit about the ASAM and the DS and the APA. The APA, as we mentioned earlier, the DSM-5 doesn't take a stand on it. So they've actually already spoken by not saying anything. They're saying the verdict is still out. We don't know. There's more research needed. ASAM is and that was this year. It came out in May, I believe. The books, we finally got them in June of this year for the DSM-5 TR. The ASAM is being redone now. And we actually just finished reading the draft version of it. If you do want to, it's 177 pages of changes. If you're interested, you could go on their website and read it and comment. But there's not a thing in there about medicinal marijuana either. So they're reserving comment as well. So thank you. Those are great questions. And I don't know if you want to answer the drug court question, Emil, feel free.
So for New Jersey, I know there are, obviously, as Jane mentioned, there was the challenges early on. People, I think when it happened, I got the sense of the sky is falling feeling from everybody, that everyone's going to be on it. It's going to, be the end of how we do things. That has been the case. The way New Jersey views it is case by case. There's not a widespread issue of multiple people in recovery court being on medicinal cannabis. There is case by case situations where, as we advise, you always want to have the doctors involved. So who's the doctor that's prescribing it? What's the condition? Let's have a conversation about, for the substance abuse evaluators that we supervise that are doing these assessments for the courts, they're going to have the conversation with the doctor regarding, okay, I did an assessment on this individual you're treating. and I found a history of a cannabis use disorder, and any other use disorders we've identified. Were you aware of this? Did your patient talk to you about these other issues they had? And let's have a conversation about, are there other things you've tried? Is this something that you think is the best option for the person? We don't enter it in any sort of adversarial approach. It's all about sharing the information and figuring out what's going to be best for this particular client. So it's case by case. Other, obviously on the legal side of things, judges and probation officers, there are some opinions people have. Some people really are, this doesn't seem right, they shouldn't be on it. And anyone working in addictions treatment, we have obviously our concerns. If you've got a substance use disorder history using anything minor mood altering, we're going to have concerns about. But it's ultimately what's going to be the best outcome for the person, and can we service them with the providers we have?
I see a question has following up with the doctors slow down the profit shops. Unfortunately, it hasn't, because we have reached out to doctors, and what we found is that those doctors tend not to call us back. They're in it, they charge like whatever their fee is, and you can come in every so often, get everything renewed. It doesn't help. But the real legitimate doctors, we have had some real good response from them.
We know our clients aren't honest with their doctors. That's the reality of it. So we give a little, of course, we go through the process of getting appropriate releases and same thing, but it's part of the process. We have to have that open communication. If you're being prescribed any minor mood altering medication, we're going to have some concerns. If we just diagnosed you with a substance use disorder and you've got a criminal history related to it, but what are we doing here? Are we going to treat it, or you're going to continue doing what you're doing? That's not the purpose that we're serving.
Excellent. We got a few more questions before our lunch break. And if we go a little over, it would put us back on time to go till 12:15. Let's see, should the DSM-5 be done with the client present, given they are often minimizing?
I think that's an interesting question. And the assessments that we do, and personally over the years, you definitely want to do a full, thorough assessment with the client present, obviously, and then after the fact, gain whatever collateral information you can, or collateral information beforehand. But I would personally never make a diagnosis on the spot like that. I would take time, review everything I've got afterwards, because those times that things sneak up on you when you go back through and read over your assessment, your full biopsychosocial and your drug and alcohol history, and then something else comes to light. So I think that's probably the best way to go about making your diagnosis, is once you've got all the details and you have a chance to look it over.
Yeah, and the minimizing part we expect. Clients will minimize, and sometimes even in New Jersey, there are certain requirements for being eligible for, we call it recovery court in New Jersey. So some clients will maximize. They may not actually have a substance use disorder. So they may, I had, 3 bricks on me of heroin because I use, that's why I had them on me. I'm a user. So we look at both angles. Sometimes people minimize, sometimes people will, exaggerate a situation. So that's why it's important to do a comprehensive assessment. So as Jane was talking, we look at the full picture, the full biopsychosocial. Does all your life areas match? You're telling me you have this serious drug problem, but you've never had any health issues. You've got no employment issues. You've been able to maintain employment. Like things have to match up. So it's not only what they tell us, but what they don't tell us. We look at all of that.
Excellent. Another question. Thank you, Mary Campbell. Is it cynical to imagine that some substance use treatment programs may ignore cannabis use issues because they know the client may not come to the program, which restricts its use, much like the field's earlier attempts to treat nicotine addiction?
Yeah, I remember those early days in New Jersey went through the same thing, banning smoking in residential facilities. When we're going to ban smoking, it is what, 15 years ago, Jane? Was that when that happened? They tried twice actually in New Jersey. I remember they tried it once and it was a disaster because clients only went to the programs that didn't enforce it. So yes, that is a very valid point, that I could see that happening in some programs, saying, well, we don't want to do that because then we're not going to get the clients.
Sad, very sad
Yeah.
to think that bad ethics.
Yeah.
Excellent. Any other questions? Well, again, let's give a big round of applause for our folks from New Jersey. What a great blessing, and thank you again to you both, Jane and Emil, for your willingness to share I got a lot out of it. I hope AOC as well is able to, and maybe there's a partnership developing here with New Jersey. Any other last thoughts or comments from the speakers?
Thank you so much. It was really fun to get to meet you all. And if we do get to collaborate, maybe we can actually be in person. That'd be even more fun.
Yeah, we just need a trip out to New Mexico. We'll see if we get it in our budget, right? We definitely appreciate everyone attending. It's an important topic, and I understand the challenges. Treatment providers, New Mexico, this is, nationally, it's an issue when there's a shift in perspective about cannabis and how do we deal with it in a criminal justice setting and how do we deal with it in a treatment setting. So we appreciate everyone taking the time and recognizing this important. And thank you, Lawrence, for letting us over to do this.
Thank you for the invitation. Enjoy the rest of your day, folks.
Excellent. And we had 143 HUVA participants, not just what we see in the the participants. So we're having a really good turnout based on 200 people signing up. So with that, we're going to break for lunch. We're going to get back on our time schedule, and we will be breaking till 12:45. I repeat, please mark your phone or your watch. 12:45. We will return with another great speaker. Thank you.